The year was 1922. Mary Smith was 24 years old, and she made her living by playing the piano. It was a good time to be a piano player in the city. Moving pictures were the greatest entertainment in the world, and every town had a theatre. The people loved to go to the movies to forget about their long days of hard work. They loved to watch the bright pictures on the big white screen. But the movies did not have any sound of their own. The actors on the screen moved their lips, but no words came out. There was no recorded talking, no recorded singing, and no recorded sounds of cars or doors closing. The only sound in the theatre came from the musicians who played live music while the movie ran. Mary was one of these musicians. She played the piano for the Majestic Theatre, the biggest and most beautiful movie palace in the city. Mary worked very hard. She played for comedies, making her fingers dance quickly over the keys to make the people laugh when a funny man fell down on the screen. She played for sad stories, pressing the keys softly and slowly to make the people cry when a young couple had to say goodbye. She played for adventures, hitting the low notes heavily to make the people feel scared when a bad man sneaked up behind the hero. Mary was very good at her job because she did not need to look at her hands. She kept her eyes looking up at the big screen the whole time. Her brain watched the story, and her hands just knew what to do. She had been playing the piano since she was a little girl sitting on her mother's lap. The piano was like a part of her own body. The black and white keys were like her own fingers. The Majestic Theatre was a massive building. It was built to look like a royal palace from a fairy tale. The front doors were made of heavy glass and shiny brass metal. When you walked inside, the floor was covered in a thick carpet that was dark red with gold patterns. The walls were painted with bright gold and decorated with carved wood that looked like vines and flowers. Above the seats there was a giant crystal chandelier that hung from the ceiling, sparkling with hundreds of little glass beads. The theatre could hold over 1,000 people at one time. When it was full, the room was very warm and smelled like hot popcorn, roasted nuts, sweet candy, and the cheap perfume that the ladies wore. But when the theatre was empty, it felt like a completely different place. It felt like a giant, cold cave. When all the people went home, the building became very quiet, and the only smells left were the old dust in the carpet and the faint smell of smoke from the projection booth. It was a Tuesday night in late November. The weather outside was awful. A cold, heavy rain was falling on the city streets, turning the dirt into thick mud and making the stone sidewalks very slippery. The wind was blowing hard against the tall windows of the theatre. The last showing of the day had finished an hour ago. The big crowd of people had put on their heavy coats, opened their umbrellas, and hurried out into the wet night to go back to their homes. The ticket sellers had locked up their cash boxes and gone home. The cleaning boys had swept up the spilled popcorn from the aisles and gone home too. The heavy front doors of the theatre were locked tight from the inside. Only 2 people were left in the massive building. One was Mary, sitting down at the front in the dark. The other was Arthur, the old man who ran the movie projector. Arthur worked up in a small, tight room way at the back of the theatre, near the ceiling. His room had a tiny square window that looked out over the seats and toward the big screen. Arthur's job was to load the big round wheels of film into the heavy metal machine, turn on the bright lamp, and turn the crank to make the movie play. Arthur was very old and very tired, but he liked Mary. He had agreed to stay late on this rainy Tuesday night to help her. Mary needed help because she had to practice. The theatre manager had brought in a new movie that was going to start playing the next day. The manager said it was a very special movie from far away in Europe. He told Mary it was not like the normal movies they showed. It was not a funny story about a man slipping on a banana peel, and it was not a cowboy story with horses and guns. The manager called it a surrealist picture. He said it was like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. Mary had to know what music to play, so she asked Arthur to run the movie for her while the theatre was empty. That way she could sit at her piano, watch the movie, and try to figure out what kind of songs would fit the strange pictures. Mary sat on her wooden bench in front of the piano. The theatre was completely dark, except for a tiny lamp attached to her piano to help her see the keys, and the bright white beam of light that shot out from Arthur's little window high above. The beam of light cut through the dark air of the huge room. Mary could see millions of tiny dust pieces floating around in the light. From way up in the booth she could hear the steady clicking and clacking of Arthur's projector machine. It sounded like a fast clock ticking. Mary watched the big screen. The manager was right. The movie was incredibly strange. It did not make any sense at all. There were no normal people talking to each other. Instead, the movie showed confusing pictures. First, there was a giant clock that looked like it was melting over the edge of a table. Mary tried to play a slow, sad song, but it felt wrong. Then the movie changed to a picture of a giant eyeball looking around a room. Mary tried to play a fast, scary song, but that felt wrong, too. Then the movie showed a man walking upside down on the ceiling of a house while holding a black umbrella. Mary stopped playing. She let her hands rest in her lap. She felt very frustrated. How could she play music for a movie that was just crazy shapes and strange ideas? She took a deep breath and rubbed her eyes. She was very tired. Her back hurt from sitting on the wooden bench all day. Her fingers felt stiff and cold because the big empty theatre was freezing. She looked up at the beam of light coming from Arthur's booth. The dust was still dancing in the light. The projector kept clicking and clacking. Mary decided she just had to try her best. She placed her hands back on the white and black keys. She watched the screen, waiting to see what weird picture would come next, so she could try to guess what to play. Suddenly, the clicking and clacking sound from the projector changed. It stopped being a steady rhythm. The machine made a harsh grinding noise, like metal scraping against metal. Then the sound stopped completely. The projector was jammed. The movie stopped moving. Mary knew what this meant. Sometimes the thin plastic film would get stuck in the wheels of the projector. When this happened, Arthur had to act very fast. He had to turn off the bright hot lamp in the projector right away. If he left the lamp on while the film was stuck, the heat from the lamp would burn the film. It would melt the picture, and sometimes it would even catch on fire. Mary waited for the beam of light to turn off. She waited for Arthur to fix the jam. But the light did not turn off. The beam stayed strong and bright, cutting through the dark theatre, and the film did not burn, it did not melt, and it did not catch fire. This was very strange. The hot lamp was shining directly onto the stuck piece of plastic film, but the film just stayed perfectly still. Because the film was stuck, the big screen at the front of the theatre was showing only one single picture. It was completely frozen, like a photograph. Mary sat on her piano bench and stared up at the frozen picture on the big white cloth screen. The picture was a dark, shadowy street corner. It looked like a street in a very old city, late at night. There were tall buildings made of stone, but they did not look right. The angles were all wrong. The buildings looked crooked, like they were leaning over and about to fall down. There were deep black shadows on the ground that looked like long fingers reaching across the bumpy stone road. There were no street lamps in the picture, and there was no moon in the sky. There were no people, no dogs, no cars, and no open windows. It was just an empty, dark, broken street corner. Mary stared at the frozen picture for a long time. She waited for Arthur to unjam the machine. She looked up at the tiny window in the back of the theatre. She could not see Arthur. She guessed that the old man had probably fallen fast asleep in his chair. He had been working all day, just like her. He probably did not even know the machine was stuck. Mary thought about shouting up to him to wake him up, but her throat felt dry, and she did not want to yell in the huge, quiet building. Instead, Mary felt a sudden wave of anger. She was tired, she was cold, she was confused by the movie, and now she was stuck waiting for a sleeping old man. She looked back down at her piano. Without even thinking, she lifted both of her hands high in the air. She brought her hands down hard on the piano keys. She did not try to play a pretty song. She did not try to play a scary song. She just slammed her fingers down in anger. Her fingers landed in a very strange way. Because she was angry and not paying attention, her hands stretched and twisted. Her fingers hit a group of keys that should never be played at the same time. Some fingers hit the white keys and some fingers hit the black keys. She pressed them all down as hard as she could. The sound that came out of the piano was awful. It was heavy, loud, and incredibly ugly. The notes clashed with each other. They fought against each other. It was a broken, twisted sound that made Mary's ears hurt. The loud noise blasted out into the empty, quiet theatre. Because the room was so big, the sound bounced off the gold walls and the tall ceiling. The ugly sound echoed again and again, growing louder and stranger as it rolled through the cold air. Mary kept her hands pressed down on the keys, holding the terrible sound. She looked up at the big screen. As the echo of the ugly notes hit the front of the theatre, the frozen picture on the screen began to change. But the picture itself was not moving. The actual screen was changing. The huge, thick white cloth that stretched across the wall began to shake. Then it cracked. Mary gasped and pulled her hands away from the keys, but it was too late. The screen did not rip like cloth. It shattered like a giant pane of glass. A spider web of deep black cracks spread all over the dark street corner on the screen. The cracks moved fast, starting from the centre and shooting out to the edges of the big wooden frame. Then the centre of the screen broke inward. Huge, jagged pieces of the screen fell away, but they did not fall down onto the wooden stage below. They fell backward into the wall, or rather, they fell into whatever was behind the wall. As the pieces broke and fell away, a massive hole opened up in the front of the theatre. The hole grew larger and larger as more of the screen shattered and fell inward, until the entire white cloth was gone. Mary sat frozen on her bench. She could not breathe. She could not blink. There was no brick wall behind where the screen used to be. There were no ropes or pulleys. There was only a giant, gaping window looking out into another place. It was a universe of absolute nothingness. Through the giant hole in the theatre wall, Mary saw an endless, wide-open space. There was no ground, no sky, no sun, and no stars. There was only a deep, endless grey colour. It was like looking into a thick fog, but there was no light shining through it. It was completely colourless. Everything was painted in dull shades of grey, black and pale white. Inside this grey space, something was falling. It looked like snow, but it was not cold and it was not white. It was grey ash. Millions and millions of tiny flakes of dead grey ash were swirling and drifting through the empty space. They moved slowly, lazily, tumbling around in a place that had no wind. A terrible coldness poured out from the hole and washed over Mary. It was a cold that went straight to her bones. But worse than the cold was the silence. When the screen broke, the clicking of the projector had vanished. The sound of the rain outside was gone. The wind against the theatre windows was gone. The only thing left was an absolute crushing silence spilling out from the grey ash universe. It was a quiet so heavy that it made Mary's ears ring. Mary wanted to stand up. She wanted to run away. She wanted to run up the carpeted aisle, burst through the locked front doors, and run into the wet city streets. But her legs would not move. Her body was locked in place by pure terror. She could only stare into the endless grey ash. Then she saw movement in the distance. Deep inside the grey fog, something was coming closer. At first, they just looked like darker shadows in the ash. But as they drifted nearer to the hole, Mary could see their shapes. They were monsters. But they were not monsters with teeth and claws like the ones in the adventure movies. These things were impossible to understand. They were colossal. They were bigger than the tallest buildings in the city. They were bigger than mountains. The entities did not have legs or arms or faces. Their bodies were huge, shifting masses that looked like giant jellyfish swimming in a deep ocean. But they were not made of flesh. They were semi-transparent. Mary could see right through them. Their bodies looked like thick moving glass or slowly turning smoke. They pulsed and changed shape as they moved. Sometimes they looked like giant floating trees with no leaves, and sometimes they looked like massive twisting clouds. There were many of them. They drifted through the falling ash with a slow, heavy grace. They moved without making a single sound. They brushed past each other, their huge, clear bodies passing through one another like ghosts. They did not seem to have any purpose. They were just drifting, endlessly moving through the dead grey universe. Mary felt tears sliding down her cold cheeks. She was looking at something that humans were never supposed to see. Her mind could hardly handle the size of the things. Just looking at them made her feel sick to her stomach. She felt like a tiny bug standing at the bottom of the ocean. The colossal things did not notice her. They did not notice the giant hole leading into the majestic theatre. They just kept drifting, turning and tumbling in the ash. They were completely oblivious to humanity. They lived in their silent grey world, and the theatre was completely unimportant to them. Mary was so afraid that she started to shake. Her hands trembled wildly in her lap. Her foot twitched. As her foot twitched, it slipped off the metal pedal at the bottom of the piano. The pedal sprang up with a loud metallic squeak, and Mary's shaking hand accidentally brushed against the piano keys. 3 soft notes rang out into the dead silence. The sound of the piano notes floated through the giant hole and entered the grey universe. The reaction was immediate. The moment the notes played, the giant clear entities stopped drifting. The entire grey universe seemed to freeze. The falling ash slowed down. The massive bodies of the things stopped turning. Then, very slowly, the colossal entities began to shift their attention. They did not have eyes, but Mary could feel them looking. She could feel the heavy, crushing weight of their focus. The giant mountains of clear smoke and glass slowly rotated. They turned their massive fronts directly toward the hole in the wall. They were looking right at the theatre. They were looking right at Mary. The feeling of being watched by these things was the worst pain Mary had ever felt. It was not a physical pain in her body, but a deep, tearing pain in her mind. It felt like a heavy stone was sitting on her brain. She knew with absolute certainty that if these things came through the whole world would turn into grey ash. The city, the theatre, the people, everything would be erased into nothingness. The pure silence of their world would swallow the earth. The massive things began to drift closer to the hole. They were moving toward the theatre. Mary panicked. Her heart pounded in her chest like a hammer. She had to do something. Without thinking, she raised her shaking hands and placed them on the piano keys. She pressed down and played a chord. A simple, loud C major chord. The sound rang out clear and bright. As soon as the music filled the air, the heavy weight in Mary's mind lifted just a little bit. She watched the grey universe. The giant things stopped moving toward the theatre. They paused. It was as if the sound of the music had confused them, or maybe it had soothed them. Mary played another chord, then another. She started to play a simple song she had learned when she was a little girl. The entities reacted. Slowly, almost lazily, they turned away from the hole. The crushing feeling of their attention faded. They went back to their aimless drifting, tumbling slowly through the falling ash, entirely ignoring the theatre once again. Mary kept playing. She played the simple song all the way to the end. She did not stop. When the song was over, she started another one. She watched the giant things. As long as she played, they drifted. They stayed away. But Mary had to test it. She had to know for sure. Her hands were shaking so much it was hard to hit the right keys, but she forced herself to stop playing. She lifted her hands away from the piano. The silence returned. The theatre was dead quiet again. Inside the grey universe, the entities stopped instantly. Once again, they slowly turned toward the theatre. The terrible weight pressed down on Mary's mind. The crushing terror gripped her throat. The things began to drift closer to the window, drawn by the silence. Mary screamed. It was a weak, dry sound, but it broke the silence. The things paused. Mary threw her hands back onto the keys and started playing as fast and as loud as she could. She played a fast comedy song. She hit the keys hard. The entities turned away. They went back to drifting. The horrible truth settled over Mary like a heavy blanket. She understood the rule of this new, terrible world. The hole could not be closed. The screen was shattered and gone. The window to the grey universe was open forever. The giant things were attracted to the silence. If it was quiet, they would notice the hole, and they would come through. The only thing that kept them away, the only thing that pacified them, was the sound of the piano. She could not stop playing. playing. Mary sat on the wooden bench in the freezing theatre and played. She played every song she knew. She played happy songs, sad songs, fast songs, and slow songs. She played the music from the adventure movies and the music from the romances. She kept her eyes glued to the giant hole. The grey ash kept falling. The huge, clear entities kept drifting, rising and sinking in the endless fog. An hour passed. Mary's back ached terribly. The muscles in her shoulders burned. The cold air from the other universe was making her fingers stiff and slow. But she could not stop. Every time she felt tired, every time she slowed her playing even just a little bit, the colossal things would begin to turn. She could feel their blind eyes looking for her. So she pushed through the pain and played faster. 2 hours passed. The theatre was still entirely dark, lit only by her tiny piano lamp and the pale grey light spilling out from the hole. Mary tried to call out for Arthur again. "Arthur!" she yelled, while keeping her hands moving over the keys. "Arthur! Please! Wake up! Help me!" But Arthur did not come. The tiny square window of the projection booth remained dark. He was too far away. He was too old. He was fast asleep, totally unaware that the world had broken open at the front of the theatre. Mary was completely alone. 3 hours passed. The physical pain was becoming unbearable. Playing the piano requires strength and energy. Normally, a pianist takes breaks. They rest their hands and their arms. Mary was not allowed to rest. Her forearms felt like they were on fire. The tendons in her wrists were tight and sore. Every time she pressed a key, a sharp pain shot up her arm and into her neck. She began to cry. Hot tears streamed down her face and dropped onto her lap. She sobbed, but she did not let her hands stop moving. The music she was playing started to sound messy. She was hitting wrong notes. Her fingers were becoming clumsy. But the giant things did not care if the music was good or bad. They only cared about the sound. The noise kept them distracted. 4 hours passed. The tips of Mary's fingers were starting to break down. Hitting the hard ivory and wood keys over and over, thousands and thousands of times, without a break, was destroying her skin. She felt a burning sensation on her fingertips. Blisters were forming on the pads of her fingers. She looked at her hands. The skin was red and angry. She looked up at the giant things. They were drifting peacefully. She closed her eyes for just 1 second. Her playing slowed down. The tempo dropped. Instantly, the heavy dread crashed into her mind. She opened her eyes and saw 3 of the massive entities turning toward the theatre. They were close now, so close that Mary could see the strange, shifting patterns inside their clear bodies. They looked like giant frozen clouds trapped in glass. The fear was so intense that Mary thought her heart would stop beating. "No, no, no," she whispered, and she slammed her hands back down on the keys, playing a loud, banging march. The entities stopped looking. They slowly drifted away, melting back into the falling ash. 5 hours passed. The blisters on Mary's fingers could not take the punishment any more. As she dragged her hand across the keys to play a fast slide, the blister on her right thumb caught on the edge of a black key. It popped. The skin tore open. A sharp, stinging pain made Mary gasp. A drop of bright red blood fell onto the white ivory key. Mary kept playing. She had no choice. She pressed her bleeding thumb down on another key. It hurt more than anything she had ever felt. A few minutes later, a blister on her left pointer finger broke open. More blood smeared onto the keys. The piano keys were no longer just black and white. They were beginning to turn red. Mary's hands were moving in a blur of pain and tears. Every time her raw skin hit the hard keys, it felt like she was pressing her fingers against hot iron. She cried out loudly in the empty theatre. Her voice echoed along with the music, mixing with the chords to create a desperate, sad noise. Through the giant hole, the grey ash continued to fall without making a sound. The universe was completely dead. There was no day or night in that place. It was just a constant, eternal grey. Mary wondered what time it was in the real world. Was it morning yet? Was the sun coming up over the rainy city? Would the theatre manager come in soon to unlock the front doors? Would the cleaning boys arrive with their brooms? She prayed that someone would come. She prayed that someone would walk into the theatre, see the giant hole, and take her place at the piano so she could rest her bleeding hands. But deep down, she knew the truth. It was the middle of the night. No one was coming for hours. And even if they did come, what could they do? If she stopped playing to run to them, the silence would fall. The giant things would turn. They would come into the theatre, and everyone would be destroyed. She was the only thing standing between the real world and the grey ash universe. Her pain was the only thing keeping the monsters asleep. 6 hours passed. Mary's hands were entirely covered in blood. The white keys of the piano were slippery and wet with red smears. Her fingers were raw, the skin worn away to the sensitive flesh underneath. Every single note she played was agony. Her arms felt like they were made of heavy lead. Her back was hunched over. She was breathing in short, shallow gasps. Her mind was beginning to break under the pressure. The lack of sleep, the intense pain, and the pure psychological horror of the giant entities were tearing her sanity apart. She started to forget who she was. She forgot about the city, she forgot about the rain, she forgot about her small apartment and her normal life. There was only the piano. There was only the blood. There was only the giant, endless hole in the wall. She stared into the grey universe. She watched the ash fall. She watched the colossal, clear bodies of the entities shifting and turning in the deep fog. They were so huge. They were so empty. Mary's fingers slipped on the bloody keys. A few wrong notes rang out, sounding very much like the terrible clashing sound that had broken the screen in the first place. But it did not matter any more. The entities did not care about the melody. They only cared that the noise continued. Mary realized that this was her life now. She could never leave this wooden bench. She could never stop moving her hands. If she fell asleep, the silence would win. If she fainted from the pain, the silence would win. If she stopped to bandage her bleeding fingers, the silence would win. She had to play until she died. The theatre remained cold and dark. Up in the tiny booth, the projector remained jammed, its hot lamp shining pointlessly against the back of the wall where the screen used to be. The dust continued to float in the bright beam of light. Down in the front row, a 24-year-old woman sat alone in the shadows. Her hands were bruised, broken, and dripping with dark red blood. She pushed the keys down over and over again, leaving bloody fingerprints on the smooth ivory. Her eyes were wide open, locked in a terrifying stare at the impossible things drifting through the colourless void. She played a nursery rhyme. She played a marching song. She played a sad ballad. She did not stop. She could not stop. Every time she hit a key, she sent a tiny wave of sound into the giant, empty universe, gently pushing back the heavy, watching eyes of the monsters. Mary Smith kept playing, weeping into the endless grey as her blood painted the piano keys, and the giant entities drifted lazily through the falling ash.